Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm going to talk to you today about a book I recently published about aircraft carrying submarines. So the book covers the entire history of aircraft carrying submarines from 1912 to 2025. It's published by Stackpole Books and it's about 300 pages. And there should be some signed copies available for you to buy if it interests you at the end of the presentation. So to give a bit of background on me, so my dad is David Gunnarsson, as it's probably apparent by our last names. Um, but I, as a kid, were really interested in two things, in astronomy and in the ocean. So I was really motivated by this 1954 Disney movie, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and also really interested in astronomy and physics. And so my 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea sparked in me an interest in submarines and also an interest in marine biology. You can see me with my dad in some seaweed here, probably in New England. Um, and so my interest in astronomy led to me doing a degree in physics. And then I combined my interest in marine biology with physics and astronomy to in my current job of graduate student at the University of Hawaii in physical oceanography and climate science. So I hope that explains that even though it's kind of out of left field for me to write this book, kind of makes sense given my background. So why write this book? There have basically been three books written about this subject before. Two are by the same author, Terry Treadwell, and they're pretty short. They have a lot of errors and they're quite outdated now. There's a third book which is in Russian, Samolyets и подводная лодка, Aircraft and Submarines, but it's very rare and in Russian, so obviously not a great mass market book. And then more generally, I think it's an interesting subject because it represents the unification of two of the most significant warfare innovations of the 20th century, the airplane and the submarine. To write this book, I used about 400 sources in seven different languages. I don't speak all of these, but I was able to use Google Translate to get a good sense of what they were saying. And by going to various archives for US Navy sources and Royal Navy sources, and then using sources in the original language of these particular navies, I think I was able to get a pretty comprehensive history of the subject. I also learned some very unusual skills. So here is a logbook from a World War One U-boat, excuse me. And back then they used this bizarre type of cursive called current shrift, which I don't know about you, but to me it looks entirely unlike any Roman characters I've ever seen. So it took quite a bit of translating, like literally translating the German and then translating this cursive to get the information. Um, and then also, just to tell a quick story about how difficult it was to get some of these sources, I really wanted to get this book, this Russian book about aircraft carrying submarines, but I wasn't able to find it for sale anywhere online. But I was able to find a Craigslist listing. However, it was the Vladivostok Craigslist, and it was local pickup only. And I wasn't going to fly to Vladivostok to get this book. So I asked a Russian friend who lived in Moscow if he could contact this person, ask if he could get it for me. And I mentioned like, oh, I'll pay you back, of course, and a little bit more for your trouble. And he was like, don't mention money. The Putin had just passed a decree in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine that exporting quote military information from Russia was illegal, and even though this really didn't fall into that, he was pretty cautious, so he wasn't able to get it for me. And then eventually through my university, it took many months, but the New York Public Library pulled it out of offsite storage. They must have had the only copy in the United States, and I was able to get it here in Hawaii and scan it and then get it back to them. So that's a bit of background on how the book came to be. So, when you think of a submarine, I'm guessing you probably think of something like this. So, this is a modern Seawolf class nuclear attack submarine. And modern submarines spend most of their time submerged, probably 99% of their time submerged. And they have these really nice, sleek, streamlined hulls that can cut through the water really well if they're totally submerged. But of course, it didn't used to be like that. In World War One, World War Two, this is what a submarine looked like. So this is a World War One U-boat, and they're basically surface ships that could occasionally submerge. They spent maybe less than 5% of the time submerged. And you can sort of start to see the problem here. So these are some the lookouts on a World War Two U-boat. And you can imagine how difficult it must have been to find merchant ships to attack. I mean, it's if you look at this photo, it's almost a miracle that they found any ships to attack. You can see the wave in front of the U-boat obscures the horizon. And this seems to be, despite the waves, a pretty nice day. You know, often in the North Atlantic, especially in winter, it was raining. They had to constantly keep their binoculars dry. It was very hard to find targets in the middle of the ocean. And so you can imagine that an aircraft would be really useful to search out targets. You're going from a U-boat bridge that's maybe at most 20 feet above the water to an observation platform that's thousands of feet above the water and can fly, 100 miles from your submarine. Would dramatically increase the search radius of your submarine. And then at the same time, aircraft had their own limitations. So at the time, aircraft had really limited range. They're very slow, and they're very fragile. They're made of wood, canvas, wire. And so the first suggestion to make an aircraft carrying submarine was actually to extend the range of seaplanes. The idea was that you would have the aircraft in watertight hangars inside the submarine and say go from Germany to just off the coast of Britain, launch the aircraft so that they could actually fly over Britain and then either recover them or they would still have enough range to get back to Germany. This was proposed before World War One by these two brothers, the Bielefeld brothers. And the German Navy did take some interest in this, although it took a while. But first, a much more simpler arrangement was tried. So this was an experiment in 1915 on the German submarine U-12, where basically they just plopped a float plane down on the deck of a submarine, motored it out to sea, and then launched the float plane when they're in the middle of the English Channel. So the aircraft flew over Britain and then came back to the base in Belgium. And in some ways, a submarine is actually a great aircraft carrier because all you have to do to launch the aircraft is just submerge underneath it. You don't need catapults. You don't even need a crane in this arrangement. The British tried something similar, but for a different reason. So, in the early stages of World War One, Zeppelins were bombing Britain, and the problem was that Zeppelins could reach much higher altitudes than British fighters or British anti-aircraft fire. And so the British noticed that actually the Zeppelins were at low altitude over the North Sea, but then rose as they went over Britain. And so the idea was if you could get a submarine out in the middle of the North Sea with these aircraft on it, they could intercept the Zeppelins while they were low over the water. So they installed these rails on the submarine E-22 in 1916, but the trials, they tested it once in a harbor, and then the next day, actually, the E-22 was torpedoed and sunk. So that put an end to the trials. But you can see that there's a bit of a problem here with this and the last example where this float plane is just, bare exposed on the deck of the submarine. It's not protected. A wave could just wash it over. That's not ideal. So in 1916, the Germans started investigating folding seaplanes to put inside hangars on board submarines. So this is the first such design, the Hansa Brandenburg W-20. It was this tiny little flying boat that could be folded up and fit in a hangar. I have a drawing of the hangar installation on the bottom. These aircraft were incredibly flimsy, and the German Navy didn't end up using them. They only built three of them. Um, However, the US Navy and the British Navy thought that the Germans had developed submarines that they could launch, or aircraft that they could launch from submarines. And so it actually caused a panic. Um, there were some suggestions that the Germans could launch bombers over New York. I'll read you a quote from the front page of the Washington Post on 2 June 1918. Nothing would so please the fatuous German sense of humor and so assuage their truculent egotism as to be able to send some of von Tirpitz's new super submarines across the Atlantic this summer to bomb American coast cities with gas shells and lyddite grenades loose from airplanes that might be launched 100 or more miles off New York, Boston, or Charleston from the decks of U-boats, or possibly fabricated hydro airplanes assembled on the surface of the sea alongside the transatlantic Unterseeboten. So, like I said, the Germans never actually developed any operational aircraft carrying submarines during World War One, but the Allies thought that they did. And actually, there were blackouts during the summer of 1918 and air raid tests that caused quite a panic, specifically because of the threat of aircraft carrying submarines. So the U.S. Navy was aware of these experiments, and after World War One, tried experimenting with their own aircraft carrying submarines. They were under the mistaken impression, like I said, that the Germans had really perfected this concept. And so they had a bunch of concepts for new submarine designs. This is one of the crazier ones. So this is a 27,000 ton submersible battle cruiser. It is a bunch of 8-inch guns and armor plating. And to find targets, it had several seaplane hangars. Um, these submarines were never built. They were absolutely enormous and really quite impractical. But the requirement to carry aircraft continued. Here's another sketch of a more realistic so-called cruiser submarine, so a large submarine that had an airplane room, as they call it. So the U.S. Navy was really interested in this concept and wanted to put airplanes on all of its large submarines. So they turned to this guy, Ernst Haenkel, who had designed the Hansa Brandenburg W-20 during World War One. And he was approached by a friend who tried to convince him to join this new company and build a submarine launched airplane. So his friend said, "We already have a contract. The Yankees asked me about the submarine aircraft you designed during the war. They're very keen on it. Keen indeed, I say. I think they badly need something like it. Even the American Naval Attaché in Berlin supports it." So Heinkel was indeed persuaded, and he produced an aircraft called the U-1, which I'll show on the next slide. But it was an interesting time in that all military buildup in Germany was prohibited after World War One by the Treaty of Versailles, and so it was illegal to build military aircraft in Germany. However, Heinkel knew that the Americans, the British, the French, the Japanese, all people who were supposed to enforce this ban, actually were quite interested in German designs. So before the inspections by these countries, a Japanese officer would tip Heinkel off, and he would go and hide his float planes in the dunes behind his factory. He also set up a shell company. These aircraft were made in Germany, but he claimed they're made in Sweden by Svenska Aero AB, which through a few mergers later became Saab. So unfortunately, that's the only real car connection I could find for this presentation. But it's yeah, quite interesting that a well-known car manufacturer had its start in some illegal military aircraft construction. So this is what he came up with, the U-1. It was a pretty small biplane that could fold and fit in a submarine hangar. The U.S. Navy bought two, and then the Japanese also bought two, which I'll talk about in a second. And it turns out that it was a little too flimsy to use, despite Heinkel's testing. So when I first started writing the book, I found this quote where Heinkel describes designing the U-1. He says the wings were attached so securely and firmly that 11 fat men could stand on them at the same time, which I thought 11 fat men were hard to come by, which I thought was just a very bizarre thing to say. But I didn't think much of it. I thought it was kind of funny, so I included it in the book. But then when I went digging and found some original documentation, I found this photo. And if you count the number of people, there are 11 people standing on this wing. But I don't know whether this says something about Heinkel's ability to exaggerate or just what it was like in Weimar Germany at the time. But I would not call these 11 fat men. Uh, anyway, I just thought that was a kind of bizarre story. Despite the fact that he piled 11 people on this wing, it ended up not being strong enough, unfortunately. So the U.S. Navy turned to slightly more conventional construction. So they bought six of these Martin MS-1s and six Cox Clement XS-1s. They're basically the same airplane, but this Martin was made out of wood and canvas, and the XS-1s were made out of duralumin, metal. And they actually did try the MS-1 on board a submarine. So this is the S-1 at Hampton Roads in Virginia in October 1923. You can see the float plane on the submarine's aft deck, and there is this tubular hangar that it came out of right before. And I can actually show you a movie. So this is the original October 1923 movie. Here they are extracting the fuselage from the hangar. They're assembling the floats and the empennage, and then they're submerging the submarine so the aircraft can float off and then take off and fly around.
Wow.
So the problem with the MS-1 was that it was underpowered, basically. It only had 60 horsepower. Um, and they tried to improve it with the XS-2, which was a very similar aircraft with so it was supposed to have a more powerful engine, but the more powerful engine threw a connecting rod, and they had to replace it with the old underpowered engine. They tested this sort of improved aircraft in 1926 and 1927 quite extensively, but because it was so underpowered and small, it couldn't take off from the open sea, and it was too underpowered to carry a radio. And if it couldn't carry a radio to relay its observations back to the submarine, it was kind of pointless. So most of the U.S. Navy gave up on this concept after these trials. The Bureau of Aeronautics, which is in charge of aircraft, was really still interested in the concept. They wanted to go a bit further in developing a folding flying boat, the Loaning XSL, which they tested between 1929 and 1933. And it was much better, but by that time, the U.S. Navy had kind of moved on and wasn't really interested in submarine aircraft anymore. So it fell by the wayside and was never tested on a submarine. The U.S. Navy wasn't the only Navy to experiment with this between the wars. So this is one of the Royal Navy's M-class submarines. They built three of them, and you can see that it has this massive 12-inch gun. The idea was that um, gun projectiles were much cheaper than torpedoes, and a ship could not evade a shell in the way that it could evade a torpedo. These submarines didn't work very well, as you might expect. The guns often flooded, and when they flooded, when you tried to fire them, they exploded. So a lot of these three submarines, most of them lost their guns and had to have them replaced. One of them, the M2, had a gun explosion and then was converted into a submarine aircraft carrier. So here is some original 1931 movie of the M2. This is the whole sequence of submarine aircraft operations, probably the only one out there. So they're wheeling the aircraft out of the hangar, they're unfolding the wings, and there is a catapult that is going to fire it into the air when they're all ready. So here they're securing it to the catapult. And then the submarine is going to run at full speed into the wind to get most airflow over the wings as possible. And then they launch the aircraft with the catapult. So the aircraft goes, flies around, does some reconnaissance, and then it lands on the water next to the M2. And they have a crane on top of the hangar that they can hook into a loop on the top of the aircraft fuselage and bring it back aboard and fold it back up, put it back in the hangar, and submerge. So unfortunately, the M2 sank in January 1932. It's unclear exactly what happened, but it's possible that she either lost propulsion or lost buoyancy while undergoing aircraft operations. You can see in this photo that water actually comes inside the hangar when they're uh, doing these aircraft operations. There was a coaming around the hatch, so like a trunk around the hatch that was about 16 inches high to keep out the water. But still, if the submarine lost buoyancy or propulsion at this point, it's possible that it could have submerged too deep and then it flooded the submarine, but we don't really know. So that ended the British trials of aircraft carrying submarines. The French developed this unique submarine, the Surcouf, which had a turret with two 8-inch guns. And this is designed for commerce raiding, so for sinking merchant ships. And these guns had such a long range that they would fall over the horizon from the perspective of the periscope. So they equipped the Surcouf with a float plane. And here you can see the float plane being extracted from the hangar. So the Surcouf was a very impressive submarine, but it was plagued with mechanical problems, and during World War II, she did serve in the Free French Navy, but ultimately she never used her aircraft in combat. It was very fragile, and she sank under mysterious circumstances in the Caribbean, um, possibly just due to her being an old, decrepit submarine, possibly being accidentally rammed by a freighter. We don't know, but that's how France's aircraft carrying submarine program ended. And there were a few other European nations which tried. The Soviet Union built an aircraft, Poland built an aircraft, Italy underwent some rather extensive trials and built a few aircraft, but none of these countries ever ended up having an operational aircraft carrying submarine. And that's generally true. The British, with the M2, had a quasi-operational capability, but just with one submarine. The French the same, just the Surcouf, and then the Americans gave up. So Europe and America eventually basically gave up on the concept by the 1930s. But the Japanese did not. So this is an extension of the quote I read to you earlier. So Heinkel's friend told him that he knew a few Japanese. They receive less aviation technology as reparations from the war. And they don't buy from the Americans or the English because they don't have good relations with them. So they buy from us, Germany. Listen, I'll make a bet with you. If the Americans buy a submarine aircraft, the Japanese will too. And 2 weeks after Heinkel sold two of the U-1 submarine launched aircraft to the U.S. Navy, the Japanese called and they asked to buy two no matter the price. So the Japanese were very interested in what all the other navies were doing in all areas of naval technology. And initially, they would buy examples of Western military craft, but then they would really innovate on them and make their own innovations. So the Japanese really were interested in this concept and developed a series of aircraft. So previously, the Americans and Europeans basically just had one trial and they concluded it didn't work very well. The Japanese had four generations of aircraft which they successively improved upon. And the concept was the Japanese are big proponents of this idea of the decisive battle, Kentai Kessen in Japanese, where the American fleet would come steaming toward Japan, and on the way, submarines would kind of whittle down this American force. And then when the diminished American fleet reached Japanese home waters, they would be crushed by the Japanese combined fleet. So the idea was that submarines had to find the American Pacific Fleet, and the way they would do that was with aircraft. So they were kind of a central component of this strategy. And the Japanese had won a very decisive battle against Russia in 1905. That war is why we have the cherry blossoms on the tidal basin, incidentally. Um, but because they had won this very decisive battle against Russia, they thought that, this is the way to win a war. And so everything they did was basically geared toward that, including aircraft carrying submarines. So this is the first of the purpose-built submarine aircraft carriers. This is the I-5. And she had two hangars quite close to the waterline, too close as it turned out. On either side of the superstructure, there's also a catapult. The second generation, here I'm showing the I-8, which had two retractable hangars in the superstructure and a catapult firing over the stern of the submarine. You can see the float plane unfolded on the deck. And then finally, they produced the Type B submarine. So this was the workhorse of the Imperial Japanese Navy, um, a very large submarine and a very fast submarine. They can make 23 and a half knots, which is one of the fastest submarines of World War II. And they all had hangars and catapults for float planes. The Japanese built, I think, about 40 of them. So they were the real workhorse of the Pacific War. So by the start of the war, the Japanese had over 40 submarine launched aircraft and 11 submarine aircraft carriers, and both of those numbers only increased as the war went on. So on December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese aircraft carriers, not submarine aircraft carriers, the Japanese surrounded the Hawaiian Islands with submarines. Here I have their positions all marked out, and I have circled the ones which carried aircraft. So it turns out that none of them actually launched their aircraft during the Pearl Harbor attack. The I-25 was supposed to do a post-battle survey of the damage, but they did not properly secure her float plane in the hangar in Japan. And so on the way to Hawaii, the aircraft got knocked around in the hangar and wasn't able to be used. But a few weeks after the attack, a submarine came back to Pearl Harbor and did a reconnaissance flight over it. So I won't detail all of the operations during World War II. They're all detailed, listed in the book. But there were over 60 reconnaissance flights over Pearl Harbor. They did Pearl Harbor several times. The Aleutians in Alaska, they did reconnaissance before and during the Aleutian Islands campaign. Um, the Japanese were very interested in what was happening in South Pacific atolls where U.S. warships were either anchored or under repair in dry dock. They wanted to know where the American forces were, and these aircraft carrying submarines were a perfect way to covertly surveil the American fleet. They flew over New Zealand and also Australia. And in Australia, in particular, it was preparation for a midget submarine attack on Sydney. They also surveilled the east coast of Africa and some of Arabia, and ended up selecting Diego Suarez in Madagascar for a midget submarine attack. Neither of the midget submarine attacks did really much damage at all, but the Japanese submarine aircraft carriers provided a pretty valuable reconnaissance service for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Probably the most famous operation was the bombing of Oregon, which was the first aerial attack on the lower 48. Alaska and Hawaii, of course, had been attacked during the war, but not the mainland United States. The target was the Siskiyou National Forest in Oregon, which might seem like an odd target, but the idea was that in the late summer and early fall, the forests on the west coast of the United States are extremely dry and very fire prone. And indeed, civil defense authorities in Oregon were really worried about specifically a submarine launched airplane coming and bombing their forest to set it on fire. And that's exactly what the Japanese tried to do. The pilot was this guy, Nobuo Fujita, who proposed the idea and then actually flew the mission. So they bombed Oregon twice, but both times, unfortunately for them, it had heavily rained in the weeks before, and so the bombs exploded but didn't catch anything on fire. Here is some views of the aircraft Fujita used. So this is not Fujita's exact aircraft, but the same type. So here you can see it ready to be launched, and it's a little hard to see maybe in this photo, but Japanese aircraft had two big red circles on the wings, the Maru, the rising sun, and usually they had a white outline. But for these special missions, they actually covered them in black paint. So you can see that here. I'm not sure if it shows up on your projector, but the red circles have a black line around them, basically to make them a little less visible on these kind of missions. So here it is being catapulted off and then flying off into the distance, and you can see the bulbous hanger on the right side of the frame. So it was a news story when Japan bombed the United States, but it ended up really having no consequence at all. No forces were diverted to the West Coast to guard it, like the Japanese hoped. Fujita actually went back to Oregon to apologize, and he was very concerned that they would hate him when he came back, and he brought this katana sword with him in the cockpit during the bombing raids, his family's samurai sword. And he brought this sword back either to give to Oregon as a gesture of peace or to commit suicide if they were mad at him, basically. And fortunately, the people of Brookings, Oregon were very happy to have him there, and he kind of started this Japanese American exchange program, and his sword is now on display in a museum in Oregon. So now on to the most famous submarine aircraft carrier. So this is a very obscure subject, but if anybody knows of a Japanese submarine aircraft carrier or any submarine aircraft carrier, is probably these, the Sentoku class, also known as the I-400 class. These were enormous submarines that had a very different purpose. So they were intended to bomb the United States. Initially, they were intended to bomb New York or San Francisco as a terror weapon. Eventually, the mission shifted to bombing the Panama Canal to make it so that all U.S. Navy ships had to go around the tip of South America. But that also ended up not being feasible. So the final mission of these enormous submarines was to engage in a suicide attack on the fleet anchorage at Ulithi, which was a large assembling area for U.S. ships that were bound to attack Japan. The submarines were hours away from conducting the attack, but they didn't do it. The aircraft were covered in U.S. markings, which is a war crime. And so all the aircraft were jettisoned overboard before the submarines surrendered. But these were enormous submarines which had a hangar which could carry either two or three aircraft, depending on the exact type of submarine. Here you can see the I-14 and the I-400 with their big hangars, and the cameraman is standing on the catapult of one of them. Here is a view into the hangar, sort of bank door-like vault. Um, the U.S. Navy was really interested in these submarines and took them over after World War II. I'll get to what happened to them in the next few slides. And this is the aircraft, the Aichi M6A Seiron, which you might notice looks way more modern than the biplanes that had previously been used, or the relatively flimsy monoplane that I showed you a few slides ago. This was a really capable, really fast aircraft that could carry either an enormous armor-piercing bomb or a torpedo. On an actual mission, these floats would not be used so that it could have maximum performance. The floats are only for training missions so that they could recover the aircraft. So on an actual mission, they would fly without the floats, and then the aircraft would just ditch in the water next to the submarine. The airmen would swim to the submarine in theory. They never actually used them in combat, so we'll never know how well that worked. But if you want to see a Seiron, the only surviving example is on display at the Udvar-Hazy Center near Dulles. So if this interests you, you can see basically the only submarine-launched aircraft left. It's a really amazing thing that it survived the war. The U.S. Navy brought it back from Japan, and it's now freshly restored at the Air and Space Museum. So the U.S. Navy took three of these submarines after the war back to Pearl Harbor. Found them very interesting, but unfortunately, the Soviets wanted to take a look at them, and the U.S. Navy was not too keen on that. And they would also be really expensive to retrofit, put new batteries in them. It really wasn't feasible, and so all three of them were um, sunk as targets off the coast of Pearl Harbor, and all three of them have been the wrecks have been rediscovered in several thousand feet of water, just a few miles from where I am right now. So another aircraft that I wanted to mention is the German FA-330 Boxstelze. So this was a towed autogyro or a so-called rotary kite. On the right, you can actually see an example, which is also at the Oddvar Hazy Center. It's exactly across the walkway from the Japanese Seiron. So the idea of this aircraft was basically to put a guy several hundred feet above a U-boat. Um, if there was enough wind, the aircraft didn't have to be, it didn't have any propulsion. It was just the rotor was just blown by the wind. Um, and it seemed to actually work reasonably well. I'll read you a quote of how it was like to fly it by one of the test pilots. Before the first flight to 200 meters towed behind a U-boat, I had serious concerns about the psychological strain on the pilot. Therefore, I trained beforehand an open cockpit glider. That was no help, however, because the view of the glider's wings in my peripheral vision gave me a feeling of security. In the free-flying Boxstelze, with a view clear through the spinning rotor, it was like sitting on a stool placed in thin air. As far as the eye can see, just water and the tiny U-boat below, and the feeling was quite horrible at first. But you get used to it, and the pilots that followed me told me that they drew spiritual support from the fact that somebody else had overcome his fears before them. Here you can see a photo of Carl Bode sitting here looking maybe a little nervous. There were a few accidents, but I believe he survived the war, so he fortunately survived piloting this weird aircraft. So here is a movie which shows how it was assembled. So there's two vertical storage tubes and a winch in this cylinder. So all of the rotor blades and the fuselage are all stored in these vertical cylinders. They just take all of this stuff out, um, assemble the fuselage. Yep, put the tail fins on. I might skip forward a little bit here. And now they're putting on the rotor blades.
What could possibly go wrong?
And so this bag you see is actually the parachute. So to bail out, you would pull a lever, the rotor would fly off, and you and the chair, the rest of the fuselage, would descend on parachute. And a British report said after that happened, the pilot was free to drown in a conventional manner. So here they are rigging the rotor, and now they've got some wind in the rotor. So the pilot has a little microphone that he can send down his observations on this telephone cord that's attached to the tow line.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, good luck.
There's the winch.
And the park.
And here he's talking with the guy on the deck, and that's probably about maximum altitude there. So it could fly to about 700 feet above the U-boat. So one aircraft or one ship was sunk with the help of this aircraft in the Indian Ocean. So they only deployed the Box Delta in the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, where Allied anti-submarine warfare presence was much reduced. So the submarines weren't quite as vulnerable. But even still, the submarine captains didn't really like them because they thought they made their submarines more visible. They didn't make them more visible to visual sighting, but they did make the U-boat a bigger radar target because the rotor blades were a pretty huge radar target. Let's see. So the box Delta, even though it didn't really work all that well for the Germans, they kind of gave up on it after 1943. They made 200 of them, and most of them were just stored ashore in crates. So there are actually a bunch of them in museums. There are maybe 20 of them in museums, and lots of different countries tried them after World War II. So the U.S. Navy tried it, the British Navy tried it, and the French Navy tried it. So this is a photo of a French captured box delta on a French submarine. So I want to read you a kind of funny quote from the pilot of that aircraft. So he said, "On Sunday, we are moored at Cannes, and on Sundays, the public can visit the warships. There was this kitchen table that was bolted securely to the submarine, so people were asking us, 'Is this the table for the crew's dinner?' And we told them, 'Don't tell anyone because it's a secret, but it's an airfield.' No one believed us." So you can see in the photo I have pointed out the literal kitchen table bolted to the submarine's deck that they used to take off from. In the book, we also cover a related concept, which is submarines refueling seaplanes. As you might imagine, this is a slightly more attractive prospect because you don't have to really have a specialized submarine and you don't really have to have a specialized aircraft. You just have to make them work together. And usually that involved installing a tank for aviation gasoline on the submarine, which was not too hard. So a bunch of different navies tried it, and it was actually used during World War II, which I'll talk about in a second. This is a Japanese submarine refueling a seaplane just before World War II. So the most famous example of this is Operation K, the second bombing of Pearl Harbor. Most people don't know that actually Pearl Harbor was bombed or attempted to be bombed twice. So in March 1942, the Japanese had this new flying boat, the H-8K, and they were really itching to use it. And they also really wanted to know what was going on in Pearl Harbor, what ships were there, if they could gauge the American naval strength. So they came up with this idea to fly from the Marshall Islands, refuel via submarine in the French frigate Shoals, which is this remote, low coral atoll in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, then fly to Oahu, bomb Pearl Harbor, and fly directly from Oahu back to the Marshall Islands. So this was the longest bombing mission of World War II, the longest until I think some of the bombing missions in the Falklands War in the 80s. So this was quite an impressive mission. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the U.S. Navy changed their weather code, and so they didn't know what the weather was going to be over Oahu in just days before the mission. So the aircraft took off, they refueled shoals, but then when they arrived over Pearl Harbor, it was just clouds and they thought they saw Pearl Harbor. They probably didn't. One of them dropped their bombs probably in the sea, and then the other dropped their bombs on Tantalus Ridge, which is about 10 miles from Pearl Harbor. It's near the university where I go to, and all it did was shatter a few windows at the local high school. So it ended up not really accomplishing much. Um, and it turns out actually this operation had a pretty big consequence for the Japanese. So I should say the Japanese had code names for all of the American islands. So Oahu or Pearl Harbor was AK. They all had two letters. So the Operation K is named because it was to attack AK. That will become relevant in a second. So they planned a follow-up operation, Operation K2, to determine whether the aircraft carriers were at Pearl Harbor right before they were about to attack Midway. So this was the decisive battle that Japan had been planning for decades. They wanted to um, bring their entire combined fleet to Midway, lure the Americans out, and crush their carrier force. And if not end the war, maybe really postpone the war and maybe have the Americans sue for peace. So Operation K2 would be a repeat of the first Operation K, but the aim was to figure out whether the aircraft carriers were there. So, one thing that Operation K revealed, so the US was reading some of the Japanese naval code, it revealed that AF was the code for Midway. And the US knew that a big Japanese attack was coming in the Central Pacific, but they didn't know where. They knew this decisive battle was coming, but they didn't know where. It could be in the Solomons, near Australia, but they didn't know it was Midway until there was a message related to Operation K2 directing a supply ship for the K operation at AF. So that told them it was Midway. And one of the most famous stories of the war in code breaking was that they suspected that AF was Midway, so they sent a secure message to Midway telling Midway to radio out unencrypted in the clear so the Japanese could hear them that they had a water shortage. And then a few days later, the code breakers decrypted a message that from the Japanese saying that AF was out of water. So once the U.S. knew that the Japanese were going to attack at Midway, they very hastily repaired their aircraft carriers, sent them out to Midway, and they were lying in wait for the Japanese carriers and sank all four of them, only losing a single aircraft carrier, and that was the turning point of the Pacific War. So Operation K, not only did it not work, but actually it kind of backfired for the Japanese. It tipped their hand at the Battle of Midway and led to disastrous consequences. The Germans also tried refueling aircraft from submarines. So in this case, this rather bizarre three-engine airplane, the Blohm & Voss BV-138, was actually diesel powered. So it had these Junkers Umo diesel engines, which meant that it could refuel directly from the submarine's fuel tanks, because submarines are in this era had diesel engines. So they tried to use flying boats to do reconnaissance in the Soviet Arctic. The Germans thought that there might be a lot of ships resupplying the Soviet war machine in the Arctic. It turns out that excuse me, there really weren't. And these aircraft didn't really end up spotting much of anything. Um, and I think at least two aircraft capsized and sunk, so it was pretty. It really didn't measure up to much for the Germans. The U.S. Navy in the aftermath of World War II was also very interested in this concept. Um, After World War II, the Air Force had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. And they had just dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and their bombers were the only way to deliver nuclear weapons. And this was an existential threat to the U.S. Navy because the U.S. Navy had no way of delivering nuclear weapons. So they tried a bunch of avenues. So they tried putting nuclear weapons on aircraft launched from aircraft carriers. They tried submarines launching aircraft with nuclear weapons, later missiles, which I'll talk about in a second. And they came up with this concept of the seaplane striking force to basically have mobile bases for seaplanes um, in the middle of the ocean. So on the left, this aircraft is the Convair Tradewind, a supply aircraft. In the middle, the Convair Sea Dart, and on the right, the Martin Seamaster, a bomber. So they had this their own kind of mini air force that could all operate from the middle of the ocean. And the great thing about the ocean is that you can't blow it up. The Soviets could not, they could strike the Air Force airfields and blow up the airfields, but you can't blow up the ocean. And at least if the conditions are okay, the runway is of unlimited length, which was a concern in those days for Air Force. Some Air Force bombers had like enormous runway requirements because they were so heavy. But if you can take off in the open ocean, that is no longer a concern. So the U.S. Navy tried it, and you can see in the bottom photo a submarine refueling a flying boat. But ultimately, the Navy came up with other ways of delivering nuclear weapons, and this all came to naught. So I mentioned that another way the U.S. Navy was trying to compete with the Air Force was via submarines that would launch nuclear attack aircraft. So this is a design for a nuclear-propelled submarine aircraft carrier with three hangars. Each of them would carry a folding version of the Sea Dart fighter that I have pictured, and the Sea Dart would carry a tactical nuclear weapon. Nuclear propulsion really made it possible to have these really large submarines carry multiple aircraft. This design and the later designs were never built, but I think they're pretty interesting. So this is an even larger design by Boeing for a submarine which could launch eight Mach 3 nuclear strike aircraft. It was never built because it was too expensive, and the other missiles were coming uh, into service at this time and made it obsolete, which I'll talk about in a second. Here is an even larger design for a 100,000 ton, not only aircraft carrying submarine, but an actual submersible aircraft carrier complete with a flight deck. Flight deck, hangar deck, elevators, everything you have on a Nimitz class aircraft carrier, you have on this enormous submarine. It could carry a full carrier air wing, 24 to 42 VTOL jets. It was nuclear propelled, also never built. It was far too expensive. And the CIA was also very interested in this concept. Um, on the right, I'm showing a declassified report of a balloon project where they would launch manned balloons from submarines. Um, I we think that they actually launched a person over Sakhalin Island, in the a Soviet island north of Japan, on such a balloon from a submarine in 1955. But it's still classified. There are a few things we know about this project. We know about all the preparation for it, all the testing, but the actual operation we know very little about, including the project name, which is redacted on all of the reports. Um, we think that they took photos of Soviet air bases and petroleum facilities, but um, like I said, there's not a lot unclassified available about it. They also wanted to launch spy planes from submarines. So this Project Hazel was an idea to launch inflatable fiberglass Mach 3 ramjet reconnaissance aircraft from submarines. The idea was that you would literally inflate a fiberglass aircraft after being extracted from a submarine hangar. It would go off and fly at Mach 3 over the target and be recovered. It turns out that making a Mach 3 aircraft out of fiberglass, flexible, inflatable fiberglass, moreover, is very difficult, and they never ended up using this. This whole concept eventually evolved into the SR-71 Blackbird, which is a pretty famous aircraft that you can also see at the Udvar-Hazy Center. But you can see why the CIA might be quite interested in launching something very covertly from a submarine. There were also a few designs for flying submarines. They're probably more properly described as submersible seaplanes because they are really just aircraft that can submerge rather than submarines that can fly, if that makes sense. One was designed in the 1930s by a Soviet engineer, never built, and another was designed in the 1960s by Convair. They did a lot of testing with the Navy on this design, and they thought it worked pretty well. Some Congress people did not like it and thought it was dumb that we were spending money on flying submarines. And so it kind of fizzled out, and by the 1970s, the US Navy was no longer pursuing it. So why didn't it work? Well, here's a quote from a British officer. He said, aircraft on submarines are impracticable except for freak submarine, freak aircraft under freak weather conditions. Freak weather conditions meaning calm conditions. And I think he was pretty right on the money. Generally, the aircraft had to be made so small that they couldn't operate in waves on the open sea very well at all. The submarines had to have this big hangar. attached to them, which not only increased their silhouette, but if that hangar got a hole in it from a, destroyer cannon or something, the hangar would flood, and that would cause problems for the submarine. And the bigger problem probably was that by the end of World War II, radar had been developed and submarines could no longer stay on the surface. Submarines had to go submerged. If they were powered by diesel engines, the snorkel was invented to keep everything but the snorkel, this air mast, out of the water so that they could have diesel propulsion. And then nuclear propelled submarines, of course, do not need the air at all. And so that was a big reason why aircraft carrying submarines went away after World War II. They were also replaced by submarines that carried missiles. So this is a submarine carrying the Regulus nuclear missile. If you think about it, a missile is really just an unmanned aircraft with a bomb in it. Um, but it offers a lot of advantages. You don't have to have all the space for the pilot. Um, you don't have to recover it because it explodes. So it makes things a lot easier. And indeed, they originally called cruise missiles pilotless aircraft. And when I was looking through the files in the National Archives for the design of these Regulus missile launching submarines, I actually found excerpts from the design of the 1920s aircraft carrying submarines in there. So the US Navy was very aware that this was basically an evolution of the aircraft carrying submarine. And then finally, even these cruise missiles became obsolete because we had to surface to launch them. And then ballistic missiles, such as the Polaris, very unusually being launched from the surface here, normally the submarine is submerged, replaced guided missile submarines as the way the U.S. Navy carry launched nuclear weapons, and currently have Ohio class submarines with Trident nuclear missiles, which are one leg of the current nuclear deterrent. So, in some sense, aircraft carrying submarines evolved into guided missile submarines, and those evolved into ballistic missile submarines. So, they're sort of with us. It's kind of the analogy, maybe a bad one that I like to use, is they're sort of like dinosaurs and birds. So, dinosaurs descended from birds. Um, uh, but we think dinosaurs are extinct today, but their living descendants, birds, still live on. It's sort of the same with aircraft carrying submarines. They are extinct, but their descendants, the missile submarines, they still live on. And it's actually the concept is having a bit of a comeback. So now drones have been developed which can be launched from submerged submarines. So this is a XFC drone launched from the USS Providence, a nuclear attack submarine in 2013. The submarine remains submerged throughout this entire evolution. It shoots out a canister from one of its torpedo tubes. That canister floats to the surface and out pops this folding drone. All the submarine has to do is keep one radio mast or periscope above the water to receive signals from the drone, and then it can receive video and control the drone. And these are used. One use is special operations. So if you're delivering Navy SEALs to a hostile country and want to monitor what's going on. You want to have some drone oversight over them. This is a good tool to use. Also, if you want to find, just like the U-boats, you want to find a target, a surface ship target that is too far away for your periscope or for your sonar, you can use one of these expendable drones to find a target. So the US Navy also has a bunch of these AeroVironment Blackwing drones. These are really small. The fuselage diameter is only 3 inches, so they can be shot out of a signal ejector tube. And they have about a 1 hour endurance, after which they just fall into the ocean. Um, and the US Navy has a few hundred of these, so they're probably actively using them now. And I'll show you a video from AeroVironment that shows how they're intended to be used. Okay. With that, thanks for listening. I'll take any questions you might have, and like I said at the beginning, there are some signed books available for $40 if it interests you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacob.
Questions?
Yeah, I got one.
Go.
For these submarines that have these hangers on them, having that hanger, did that reduce their maximum depth capability? Because these big
Yeah,
hangers.
so usually the hangars were indeed designed for the same maximum depth as the submarine. There was some concern that if they got depth charged, the hangar door might spring open. Even if the hangar door springs open temporarily, that could very easily flood your submarine. Um, so yeah, they were designed for the same depth as the rest of the submarine, but they were often thought to be more vulnerable to depth charges.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions, Jacob? That's it.
I got one.
Go.
What are the little that look like windows, portholes on some of those 30s submarines that follow the top edge of
On the water
So the
line.
cutouts in the hull.
vents?
Yeah, so let's see if I can I'll go find one. Well, here you can see has windows in the sail. Those three little black dots. So those are actually in the non-watertight bridge. So in ye olden days, they had usually an open bridge and an enclosed bridge, so that in rough weather you could at least have some protection from the waves while you were running on the surface. But there are old submarines, like World War One submarines, actually had small sight glasses in the conning tower, so genuine sort of windows in the pressure hull. But in general, of course, that's a vulnerability, and it's much more robust just to have a wholly steel pressure hull. So I think all of the windows shown in this presentation have been just windows for the free flooding bridge, basically.
You're talking about the long row of windows down close to the water line?
Right along the water,
Oh,
all these windows that look like
Yeah.
oh, okay. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can
Yeah, it's all right. I know what you're
explain
talking
with
about.
one of these. Yeah, so if you look in this drawing, it's a little hard to see, but can you see my mouse at all?
Uh, the lights are. Can somebody
the
fill the
lights.
lights? Okay, now go ahead.
Can you see my mouse at all?
See your mouse, yes.
Yeah, okay. So you see this, so this bolded line is the pressure hull, and then there's this slightly thinner line, which is the outer hull. So this is where the ballast tanks are. And the ballast tanks usually, if I go back to this photo, the ballast tanks usually only go up to the water line, because if you have a ballast tank above the water line, it's not really doing anything when you're on the surface. And so submarines often had the deck and superstructures all free flooding. And so, especially in the World War II days, when submarines weren't going very fast, they had this free flooding superstructure. So this is basically how the water drains out after the submarine surfaces. After World War II, submarines, went underwater a lot more and were much faster. And so they closed up a lot of these because they ended up causing turbulence and noise and drag. Um, but yeah, old submarines were, like I said, basically kind of ships that could submerge. So everything that wasn't the pressure hull had to flood in one way or another. So you end up with something that it looks like it has a lot of holes in it. The pressure hull doesn't have any holes, it's totally sealed, but the outer hull often has a bunch of so-called limber holes or vent holes to make sure the superstructure properly floods and drains.
More questions for Jacob? Is that it? Really?
I got a question.
Or one question?
What was your favorite part of what you learned about when you wrote this book? What was your favorite part of
Uh,
submarine or?
Um, well, so one difficulty in writing this book is that basically everybody's dead. Because the last aircraft carrying submarine was made in or was in service in 1945, that there were these concepts that I showed you from the 50s and 60s, but basically no one is left surviving to talk to me about this. And so that's why I really enjoyed that's part of why I put the quotes in this presentation, but also why I put them in the book. Because I really enjoyed having this perspective from people who are actually there. I feel like it adds more of a human connection to something about machines. I put as many of those in the book as possible, but it was really fun finding them. And for example, this one was originally in French, so I had to translate it. This one was in German, I had to translate it. But it was very satisfying hearing about these things. Um, from the people who were there. And I'll also say maybe I undersold a little bit how obscure this whole concept was. So there are these two books written about it and a few articles. But in general, if you see aircraft carrying submarines mentioned in a book, it's maybe one sentence. It's basically a footnote. Um, it was very, very difficult to find information on any of these. In the National Archives, I spent many, many, many days sifting through documents to try to find stuff. So to actually, hear people talking about it, like Heinkel, sort of in their own words, instead of just seeing some dry technical document, that was very satisfying. And then also, it was really cool going. My dad and I went to the Udvar Hazy the Air and Space Museum archive, and they actually had this book um, about the Heinkel U-1, which was, you could see Heinkel's signature in it, in his own hand that he wrote, which was really cool. Heinkel, the name may be familiar. He designed some bombers that were used by Germany during World War II. Um, so it was really cool seeing these documents. It was sort of the closest I got to actually being there in some sense. Yeah, that was a very long-winded answer to that question, but yeah, learned a lot of interesting things writing this book.
So that was the same Heinkel that made other Nazi planes. And I
Yes.
believe the bubble car after World War II
Yeah.
was came from a piece of fuselage stamping. It could still stamp out. And it competed against the little three-wheel BMW Isetta. Because they were trying to
Yep.
build,
Same Heinkel.
yeah, they salvaged that piece of machinery and stamped that out, made that little car.
I'll share that on that trip to the archives at Udvar Hazy with Jacob. It was pretty thrilling to be able to handle this book that's shown and a few other things that you knew were the personal property and possession of Heinkel, and he had signed it. His fingerprints were on it, his DNA's on it, and there it is on the table for you to flip through. It's just it was
Yeah.
a little bit of a chill through my spine to do that kind of stuff. It's amazing.
And this exact document would have been supplied with this aircraft. So when this aircraft was sold in the United States, it came with this booklet. You can even see it says Navy Department 1922 on the top. And it's to me rather remarkable that it survived and that the Smithsonian has it. And you can, if anybody of you in the audience are interested in it, you can just go there and they will provide it for you. It's pretty cool. And these are rare aircraft. Only two were ever built, and not scrapped like a year later. So to have this surviving is quite remarkable.
Jacob, looking back on this whole episode, I mean, it seemed to me this concept is kind of an interesting one, and with today's technology, it might have been able to work, but it seems to me it was kind of like doomed from the start, this whole idea of submarine launched aircraft. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Um, I think so. Part of it. So the Germans were the ones who really kickstarted it, and people thought that they had perfected it. I mean, they thought they had perfected it so much that they, blacked out New York during 1918. And so the US Navy was basically convinced that it could be done. And they literally even said this in several reports that basically our efforts aren't working, but we know it can be done because the Germans did it. Um, After World War One, the Germans were pretty, like German designers, individual people like Heinkel were quite desperate for work because it was in Weimar, Germany. The economic conditions were really bad then. And so they were really willing to oversell what they did during the war. And the US Navy really liked German U-boats. And so basically the Germans could do no wrong in their eyes. They were the engineering masters. And so basically the US Navy was convinced that it could work. And because the US Navy was putting so much effort into it, all of the other navies saw that and they thought, oh, we got to get in, we got to get in on this. Um, Either because they thought it was a really good idea or because they just didn't want to be left behind. And so it was, I guess it's sort of a fad, is what I'm saying. It was a fad that a bunch of company or a bunch of countries kind of copied each other. And it just so happened to kind of stick with the Japanese. It fit really well into their doctrine. Although I'll point out, and I point out in the book, that the Japanese horribly misused their submarines at Midway. So Midway, as I mentioned, was the attempt of the Japanese to engage in a big decisive battle with the Americans. And this is exactly what the aircraft carrying submarines were designed to do, but the aircraft carrying submarines were up in the Aleutians for some reason. They didn't use them at Midway. If they used them at Midway, maybe they could have spotted the American fleet coming. Maybe they could have turned things around at Midway. But instead, no, they were looking at where they could, land troops in the Aleutians, which itself was kind of a pointless campaign. So, and also, when they tried to bomb the US, they bombed a forest. What would have happened if they bombed San Francisco or LA or Seattle? I think that would have had way more impact. So I think you can imagine ways in which aircraft carrying submarines had a much bigger impact, and we would view them more as, I still don't think they would be around today for the reasons I mentioned, but I think we would view them like as battleships, something that had a legitimate use once. But because the Japanese really didn't know what to do with their submarines, they kind of squandered this opportunity. Um, yeah, but I overall do agree that I agree with you, and I agree with that British officer who said freak submarine, freak aircraft under freak weather conditions. It was a very, very interesting idea. It was maybe not the best idea, especially for the aeronautical engineering at the time.
When you were doing all your research, did you stumble across stuff in the Soviet Union with bad quality control and bad welds? I've heard stories where they had two to sixes propped up to the hulls from coming in on each other. Was that
Yeah,
widespread?
so there are a few Soviet projects are covered in the book. They ended up not being interested in the concept so much. The Soviets are kind of interesting in that actually, um, the Soviet Union produced some of the most innovative submarine designs ever during the Cold War. Um, the Soviet Union spent way too much money on it. They were outspending us probably in terms of submarine development, and they produced some truly exceptional submarines. Um, they did have some issues, especially early on with reactors. In the early days, they had a lot of reactor accidents that were very bad indeed. They also had a few fires. So there were some cases in which um, the Soviets were an advantage, a disadvantage, although a lot of times it was because they had very poor training. They were relied on a lot of conscripts who had no idea what they were doing. And, conscripts operating a nuclear submarine doesn't, is not a great idea. Um, they only in there for 2 years, and yet they're operating a, nuclear reactor. Bad idea. But in general, the Soviet engineering and design was exceptional. The U.S. Also produced exceptional submarines, but was far more conservative. There was a Russian submarine designer. The U.S. Navy had this guy, Rickover, who perhaps you've heard of. He was the guy who sort of forced nuclear propulsion into the U.S. Navy. And a Soviet designer told his American colleague that here in the Soviet Union we had democracy in our design. You, with Rickover, had Stalinism. So, ironically, the Soviets actually were able to produce some truly exceptional submarines. The world's fastest submarine, the world's deepest diving submarine, the world's largest submarine. Um, it all rotted away after the fall of the Soviet Union and their shadow of their former selves. But in the day, the Soviet Union had a very formidable submarine force.
Anything
Question
else?
about Germany, why did they have such a significant part in submarines? In terms of getting the war, we blew up all of our merchant ships. They were
Yeah,
very significant.
yeah, definitely. So the Germans had a big advantage early on in that they were the world expert in diesels. I think auto diesel, I assume, was German. But a big problem in early submarines was how to power them. Um, Early on, they used kerosene or heavy oil engines, which were terrible. They then switched to gasoline engines, which are a terrible idea for a submarine, because, as you know, gasoline vapor is very combustible, whereas diesel is relatively benign. So the Germans had exceptional diesel engines during World War II, and that's what allowed their submarines to be far superior to what
What?
anyone else was building. Sorry.
What? Thank you.
Um, and I think that just snowballed into the Germans just investing a lot in U-boats. I mean, they had the motivation in that if they could sever the supply line between the U.S. and the United States, sorry, Britain and the United States, they could win the war both in World War I and World War II. They ended up not being able to do it, but yeah, I think the combination of superior technology and just like they were early in the development of diesels and submarines, and then also just the motivation in wartime of cutting off Britain and Western Europe from the United States was a big motivator for them to develop submarines. I will say though, their submarines, they worked, but boy, they were pretty miserable. They had no heating, no air conditioning. Everything was moldy. It was cold. They were like the minimum habitation necessary to keep people alive and functioning to hunt merchant ships. So they worked, but boy, you just have to watch the movie Das Boot if you want to see what it was like on them. Not fun.
Great movie.
I read where they got the best coffee, the best food, but they had to just press
Yeah,
the stumps.
the Americans who had ice cream machines on their submarines. There's a famous story where a Japanese naval officer knew that Japan had lost the war when he saw he was a POW at that time. He saw that the Americans had a ship devoted entirely to making ice cream. When he saw that, he knew that Japan lost. As if they could devote an entire ship to making ice cream, there was no way that the Imperial Japanese Navy could ever win.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, thanks. Yep.
Appreciate your efforts.
Yep.